What I'm going to try to do this morning is to cover what usually takes me about 3 weeks to do, all right? And rather than give you a bunch of dates and events and treaties and wars and battles and this sort of thing, I'd rather give you the large picture. And one of the questions involved in that large picture is, why is it that roughly around 1521 or so, the Spanish colonial outpost in what we now call Mexico City had basically been established. And yet we have to wait until 1769 for Father Serra to begin limping up the coast of California to establish the missions. What explains that huge gap of time? Why is it that Spain took so long, in a manner of speaking, to get to Northern California and begin what turned out to be a failed attempt to use Alta California, as it was called at that time, as a source of defense against predator nations, predators in the sense that they were trying to take advantage of Spain's obvious weaknesses to begin to nibble away, if you will, at the edges of this vast empire that at one time included various parts of what we now call Italy, principalities of various sorts, various parts of the Low Countries, as they were called at that time, now basically the Netherlands and so on. At one time controlled all of the Iberian Peninsula, including Portugal, not to mention the Americas and its possessions in the Pacific, particularly the Philippines. It was fighting for its presence in the so-called Far East throughout China, India, and so on. Spain, Britain, the Dutch, and so on were all involved at various points in time in extending their empires toward the Pacific. At the same time, Spain had to contend with the rise of new powers in Europe, and in some cases the decline of those powers in Europe, as it impinged upon Spain's geopolitical interests. And in that respect, then, in order to understand that 200-year gap, we have to understand what was going on that surrounded, if you will, Spain's imperial power in such a way that it took that long for Spain to begin its process of settlement and occupation of what was then called Alta California. The second major picture, in a sense, I want to discuss with you is a transition from Spanish rule, which was basically not rule at all, over Alta California, and what became Mexican territory. And how quickly Mexico, in effect, lost what was then called Alta California to another country, namely the United States, after the US-Mexican War and so on. So what explains this very quick change, in a manner of speaking, vis-a-vis the United States and Mexico? And again, international forces and events will impinge upon that particular question. And the third transition, now we're jumping all the way to the present, is to examine, in a sense, Sonoma as a site of those transitions. We have the Bear Flag Revolt statue right there at the plaza. We have the mission, if you will, which wasn't completed until, quote unquote, the Mexican era of Alta California, even though its initial impetus came from that effort established by Father Serra in 1769 in what is now called San Diego. And in that regard, when we see Sonoma, in the background is a wonderful example of a transition. And it's what I call bottle shock. And those of you who've read the book, seen the movie, and so on, you know what I'm talking about. And that is the internationalization of the wine industry. An industry that already, when you go to the Vallejo home, they rotate the exhibit that they have there. And one of the interesting things that is sometimes exhibited at various moments in time, because again, they change the cases and what's in there, are several medals earned by Mariano Vallejo for his wine in one of the very first expositions of California in 1853, where medals were given to those who produced the best wine. And that's among the reasons why we're going to visit a winery. Not necessarily so we all get tipsy and we fall asleep on the bus home, all right? But rather to understand the international forces and events that impact on a very contemporary transition that's taking place. A transition that changes, the face of Sonoma County. It changes the labor force of Sonoma County. It changes the occupational profile of Sonoma County. It changes the demographic characteristics of Sonoma County. And many of those changes, if not all of them, in one way or another, are tied to this larger picture that includes Chile, it includes Argentina, it includes New Zealand, it includes Australia, not to mention Portugal, Spain, France, Germany, and even a few places outside of California. New York produces wine. Of all places, Texas produces wine. God-awful wine, but it produces wine. Okay? And so on. Not to mention backyard vineyardists here in and around the Bay Area. So I'm going to try to do all of that very quickly. And in any story of this sort, we need a major figure. You can decide whether villain or hero or a combination of the two. And the thread that, in a sense, links the first two elements here that I want to discuss, these two transitions, is Great Britain. Because Great Britain rises in power in the 18th century. And by the beginning of the 19th century, all of us know who teach history and so on, that is all usually considered the British century. And it's not until the 1890s, beginning of the 20th century, that Britain begins to decline as a world power. Accelerated by World War I on the one hand, and the position of the United States after that. And by the end of World War II, it's over for the British. When they leave Hong Kong, it's kind of like the cherry on top of this cake that has been falling apart for roughly 50 years. All right. Great Britain is not a world power at this time. They would like to think so. And that's why once in a while they trot out Daniel Craig 007 to remind us of how important Britain is to the world. But in fact, it's a secondary power in the larger scheme of things. All right? And some people might even argue a third place power at this point. Not to mention Spain, which no one mentions for obvious reasons. It is no power, if you will. Okay? So, let me begin with the transition of Alta California from Spanish colony to Mexican territory. What are some of the key elements in here? How do we explain, first and foremost, the weakness of Spain? It has a long history. I'll just mention very briefly, from roughly 1550 until 1650. 1648 if you want to be exact, the Treaty of Westphalia, which no one needs to remember. Spain had expended huge amounts of its resources that it was extracting to a large extent from its colonial possessions in wars to defend Catholicism, or the other way around, to suppress the spread of Protestantism. Spain became the defender, if you will, of the Catholic faith throughout Europe, which meant it got involved in a series of wars that drained the Spanish treasury to a large extent. So much so that by the middle of the 17th century, many Spaniards consider this the kind of the beginning of the end of its colonial empire. It could no longer defend itself very easily, for example, against the Dutch. It could not defend itself very easily, if it ever did, against Johnny Depp and his Caribbean pirates, or whatever it may be, all right? Clearly, Spain was already on the defensive by the beginning of the 1700s. And it showed in a variety of ways. It showed itself especially in the fact that all of the colonial energy of Spain was focused on two pillars of its empire: Peru and its silver mines, so parts of Bolivia, and Mexico. But unfortunately for Spain, already by the end of the 17th century, Peru's silver mines had been exhausted, and it depended increasingly on the revenues generated by the Mexican silver mines and to a lesser extent by the various colonial commodities coming from its colonial possessions, including Mexico. Keep in mind, Cuba was not a big sugar exporter yet at this time. So Spain then faces a series of financial crises. It begins to come up with all kinds of schemes in order to generate more revenue, including at times trying to find ways of extracting from the Catholic Church in Spain monies, resources, loans, and so on, in order to support this bloated monarchy on the one hand, and now a bloated colonial bureaucracy on the other. It began to sell titles. So if you had enough money, you could become a baron, a duke, a count, and so on. In a sense, it was selling social, political, and economic status as a means of trying to increase its revenues. In the meantime, Spain has to contend with 3 or 4 major powers. And by far, the one that was most important early on would be France, right next door. And it had to deal with the influence of France in Europe in such a way that, again, it was a preoccupation on the part of Spain. And all of us are aware right now, we're in a situation not unlike Spain in certain respects. We have Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, and that's just in that part of the world. Not to mention our concerns in Europe, Greece, Portugal, Spain. And the other day, a bank became very weak in Portugal. And what happened to the stock market? It went down almost 200 points. All right? So we have those preoccupations. Not to mention what's going on in the Pacific, China. And if China growth rate continues to go down, it's not good for us, because China has us in many respects around the neck. They don't have to squeeze with both hands, in a manner of speaking. All right? So in this period of time, the Bourbons become the dynasty of Spain. It had been the Habsburgs, Austrian Empire, etc. But at the beginning of the 18th century, rule goes over to the Bourbon family. And by the middle of the 1700s, there is an effort to re-energize the Spanish Empire by the Bourbon king at that time. We won't get whether it's Charles III or Philip or whatever. We can put that aside for now. For our purposes, what's important, the intent of the Bourbon reforms was to reorganize the colonial empire. And part of that reorganization is to try to get the empire to pay for more of the expenses that were being expended by Spain in order to maintain it. So it tried to make it more efficient, it tried to make it more effective, especially in the production of revenues for the Bourbon kings. One way of doing that was to increase taxes. That sounded like 1763 when Britain had to do the same thing, all right, etc. This angered the residents, if you will, of Latin America, particularly the elite, the native elite of the Spanish American colonies, otherwise known as criollos. I use the term criollos, not creoles, because that confuses the meaning. It has nothing to do with Creoles here in the United States, and so on. And as part of that reform, particularly in light of a rise now of a European power that is ambitious, it's voracious, and it tries to extend, if you will, its domain at the expense of those weakened European states at that time. And we're talking now about Russia. And Russia begins to move down from what we now call the Aleutians, along the Alaskan coast, and begins to make claims in what we call the far northwest, including a claim that now impinges upon 3 other countries. Britain, from Canada and so on, had claimed what we might call the Upper Oregon Territory. The United States had also had claims in that direction because of claims made by a ship and so on under the U.S. flag already at the end of the 18th century, etc. And of course, Spain and even France wanted to nibble away, if you will. But clearly the 3 contenders were Alaska, Britain, and the United States. Spain. This Alaskan venture on the part of Russia is just one example of these changing political positions geopolitically within Europe and outside of Europe at this time. And in the midst of those reforms, these efforts that ticked off many of the criollos in the Spanish colonies, because they were not allowed any longer to become officers in the Spanish army in the colonies. They were no longer allowed to be what we would call judges in the higher level of the judiciary of the colonial system. They were not allowed the best jobs in terms of the collection of revenues and the like. All of these things had begun to displace then the criollo elite in the Spanish colonies, and they didn't like those demotions. And the origins then of independence movements, particularly in Mexico, go back to that period of time. All right? It also attempted to kind of squeeze the Catholic Church in the colonies. And part of that squeeze was to bring the so-called religious orders under a heavier thumb, in a manner of speaking, such as the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Augustinians, and the ones that were the most stubbornly against these efforts on the part of the Spanish king to kind of squeeze the privileges and so on of the church would be the Jesuits. And the situation became so intense that in 1767, the king said, okay, you Jesuits, you are out of here. And they were expelled from all of the Spanish colonies. Now, why did the king have that authority? If you want, in the Q&A, we can discuss that. The important point is the leading spearhead, if you will, of the missionary effort that was still going on in the Spanish colonies. The Jesuits, militant defenders of the faith, were gone. And someone had to take their place. One of the orders had to take their place. It turned out to be the Franciscans. That's why it was Father Serra. If it wasn't for that contention between the king and the Jesuits, it's highly likely that the Jesuits would have been given that responsibility, not the Franciscans. Because the Jesuits were in charge of the missions in Baja California, and they would have just gone up from there. When the Franciscans were installed in there, that's why they were the ones given first chance, in a sense, to move into Alta California. The plans of the Bourbons was disrupted and to a large extent were crippled indefinitely by the 7 Years' War. We call it the French and Indian War in American history. What's important about the 7 Years' War is that the Brits were able to take one of the key defensive outposts of the entire empire, because there was one port where all of the goods coming from the Pacific would go through Mexico, come out on the other side of Mexico in the port of Veracruz, and those commodities would be repackaged, in a sense, into the fleet that would leave the port of Havana to go back to Spain. All of the major commodities of the Americas were collected and brought to Havana, refitted, put on refitted ships in order to get to Spain. So Havana was crucial. It was a major conduit of the Spanish colonial system. So when the British defeated the Spanish forces there in Havana and held on to Havana as part of the bargaining for the treaty that ended the war in 1763, it was a wake-up call, which unfortunately occurred in many respects too late for the Bourbons. Wow, we've got to deal with this weakening situation of our empire, particularly the last bastion of revenue production, which was, of course, Mexico. So we had to defend, more so than ever before, that northern tier above Mexico against the possibilities of someone coming in, and that someone could be the British, as they proved in the case of Havana, and it could be this upstart new power that seems to be making noises of trying to be an imperial power called Russia. And that's exactly why, to a large extent, the Bourbons then authorized, because no one could just travel throughout the Spanish Empire, authorized then the Franciscans to make an effort to colonize Alta California in a much more effective way than ever before. And keep in mind, there was a huge gap between Vizcaíno and Cabrillo and all these characters going up and down the California coast before we actually established any real outpost in what we now call California. The strategy was pretty simple. The missions convert indigenous people, you make them Spanish subjects, and over time those Spanish subjects will defend the interests of Spain against whomever might want to take, in this case, Alta California. That was the basic formula. It never worked that way, but that was the intent. And Father Serra wanted to make the indigenous people good Spanish subjects. Make them Catholic, make them subservient to Spain, the Spanish crown, and eventually to become good Spanish farmers and the like. That was, again, the crude, if you will, formula that was intended. But then, if you're pardon the expression, all hell breaks loose. And that hell that breaks loose is the French Revolution. 1789 to 1850. French Revolution scares the holy bejesus of all the monarchies in Europe, including the constitutional monarchy across the Channel, Great Britain, because of this radical idea, radical ideas in the plural, generated by the French Revolution. Now at first, Britain is in no position to become directly involved in what became known as the Napoleonic Wars, because Britain was in huge debt. That's one of the reasons why they tried to raise taxes here in their 13 colonies and elsewhere in their fledgling empire. They had their hands full at that period of time, and rather than sending the British Army to fight immediately in the continent and so on, they paid others, mercenaries, to fight for the British interests against what became the French forces, first under the Revolution and especially once Napoleon rose up in power. So this perception about Waterloo and the British Army and so on, that they were latecomers to the wars generated by the French Revolution, in part because they were just not prepared to send British men to go fight for British interests as they saw it regarding the French Revolution. Spain, of course, is sucked in to that revolution. I won't go through all of the stages involved, but what's important here, by being completely preoccupied, the Spanish monarchy, by the implications of the French Revolution and so on, then Spain turns virtually all of its focus onto what's taking place in Europe, leaving stranded here in Alta California the missions. The ships that conceivably could bring supplies and so on don't come, and when they do try to come, many of them don't make it. So the missions and the presidios, the soldiers and so on, are on their own, essentially. There is virtually no support from the Spanish crown coming to these missions, and the missions in this respect have to make do. They have to struggle, survive, and so on, in the midst of the fact that Spain is not in a position to re-provision, to provide defense, and the like. This is among the reasons why the mission system stayed along the coast. There was no resources to make incursions into the interior of California. Parentheses, the interior of California at that time was a pit. There were no dams. And because there were no dams, a lot of Central California was one huge swamp. with humongous mosquitoes, okay, about the size of Piper Cub airplanes. Okay? So it was not a good place to go necessarily, unless you were a fur trader and you wanted to trap beaver and so forth and so on. That was a different story. But what's important here is the missions are, in a sense, orphans of the conflict that is taking place in Europe, and Spain's situation vis-a-vis the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Spain will be invaded by Napoleon, and as a consequence of that, it creates dissension within Spain itself between liberals who wanted to adopt, and in some cases completely embrace liberalism in Spain, versus those who wanted to conserve the old system, which became the conservatives. And this struggle in Spain compounded the inability of Spain to defend the colonies easily from outside forces and events. In this regard, then, when Spain is challenged by its colonials, beginning in 1810, Bolivar in the south, Father Hidalgo in the north, and then others as time went on. This is one of the reasons why the wars of independence were so long. It took roughly 10 years for those wars to, in a sense, get to their completion. And it was, in the case of Mexico, the absolutely most brutal part of the wars of independence. Why was it so brutal? Because the stakes were so high on holding on to Mexico, because that had been the goose that was producing the golden egg in many respects for the Spanish Empire. And Spain wanted it back. But it could not do so. And eventually Spain had to concede at that time to forsake its claims on Mexico temporarily. Which brings me to something that almost no one discusses, and that is the war between the United States and Spain in 1829. It didn't happen. The Monroe Doctrine was 1823. When Spain invades Mexico in 1829, one would expect the American fleet to immediately set sail to defend Mexico against this European intruder. But what does the United States do? It sends a letter to Madrid saying, you guys shouldn't do this. This is not very nice. All right? For you to retake this ex-colonial possession. As it turned out, the Mexicans were able to defeat the Spanish force that landed around the area of what we now call Brownsville, Texas. They were defeated not only by the Mexican army, which was very small and weak, but more so defeated by yellow fever and a tremendous problem of dysentery. That probably did them in more so than Mexican troops, although the Mexicans in their museums and so, of course, talk about the glories of the Mexican army and its defeat of the Spanish forces. But what's important here is that Spain was like hanging fruit that was too ripe. Ripe with corruption, ripe with inequalities, ripe with a long history of decline. So when it falls from the tree, in a manner of speaking, it is already a foregone conclusion. And it leaves, if you will, Europe in a very different situation. A new order develops, and Spain's decline continues all during the 19th century. It is so bad that already by 1836, 70% of all of the sugar leaving Cuba is not moving for Spain to resell. It's going right across the Gulf Channel to the United States. Already by 1840, the United States dominates the economy of Cuba, which, by the way, of course, as some of you know, during this period of time over the slavery issue, etc., Cuba is seen as a possible second state or additional state for the South. So Britain comes out of the Napoleonic Wars as a major European power, and one would arguably a world power. What's important for California in that respect? What's important for California is, as a consequence of Britain's position and role in this period of time between the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars and the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Britain is consumed with domestic problems on the one hand and international problems on the other. And the combination of the two pushed Britain to begin to withdraw and back away from certain parts of the world because it simply cannot cover. It simply is stretched out too thin as a means of trying to effectively defend its interests outside of Europe and its empire and its imperial implications. Domestically, I'll only mention two things. One, the contention that will go on through the early part of the 19th century over the question of political representation in England, what we call Parliament. In 1790, only 6% of the men, women of course, were a secondary thought, if that, in that respect. Only 6% of the men could vote in elections in England. Meaning, with the industrialization, with the ongoing commercialization of England and so on, we have this middle class. And this middle class doesn't necessarily appreciate the power of the aristocracy over the political fortunes of the country. With industrialization, another constituency begins to grow much faster, the working class. So England has to contend what we're going to do with the aristocracy, what are we going to do with the middle class, what are we going to do with the working class. And those domestic issues will lead to the famous Reform Bill of 1832, where the alliance between the middle class and the working class for more political representations will be sundered, and where the British then will concede political representation to the middle class, but continue to keep the working class from having a major voice in the politics of Spain. And that leads to a series of conflicts between the working class of Britain and British authority. And I won't go through all of the riots, all of the conflicts, all of the shooting of workers, and so on, the Chartist movement, and so on. And needless to say, there's this guy named Robert Owen and Karl Marx watching all of this, and there's no coincidence why the Communist Manifesto comes out in 1848. Right? It builds on those series of conflicts that is taking place in England in the early part of the 19th century. So it has to contend with those kinds of issues, political and so on, the Tories versus the Whigs, and so on. Kind of like Republicans versus Democrats right now. Okay? All right. On the other hand, Britain had its hands full with its imperial geopolitical concerns. Already, by the beginning of the 19th century, it had defeated the French and the Dutch in the control over India, which was the jewel of the British imperial system. And in order to pay for that system, they began to trade even more so, or tried to trade with China. The first Opium War takes place in 1839 to 1842. In order to protect its geopolitical position then, as I suspect all of you know, Britain had to protect the sea lanes coming from China and India all the way to England. That got them involved by 1800 into South Africa. And many years later, that would lead to a conflict between the original Dutch settlers, the Boers, and the Brits. It forced them to deal with Africans, organized tribes and so on. The most famous would be the Zulu Wars, and so on. Again, stretching the British imperial fleet, stretching the British soldiery and so on from that part of the world to the other. And then they have to deal with this upstart Catholic place already in 1798 called Ireland. The goddamn Irish, all right, sort of thing, all right? And they have to send in a military force over to Ireland to deal with that. And they're keeping an eye on Latin America because those sea lanes go right by two major countries. Brazil on the one hand, which makes Britain at that time, before soccer became very important, really good buds with the Portuguese. All right? And in fact, that's one of the reasons why Napoleon invaded Spain in the first place, was to in fact get to Portugal and try to use Portugal as a buttress against the Brits. And of course, it had to also deal with that other country on the Atlantic side, as British ships theoretically would pass by the sea lanes there, and that is of course Argentina. And to this day, you can play cricket in Argentina for a good reason. Okay? But if you want in Q&A, we can discuss more fully that relationship between Argentina and Britain. So in this situation, there's a vacuum begins to take place. A vacuum that goes back at least to 1812. Why did we start the war with England in 1812? It's a very short war. And we celebrate, more so than anything else, a battle that took place after the war was officially over, all right? The Battle for New Orleans. So why would the United States try to take on Britain at that point? The obvious answer is they assumed, the leadership and so on of the United States, that Britain was so distracted with its concerns overseas that this is our opportunity. How dare they take our sailors from ships and so on, violate the sovereignty of the United States, all right? We were upstarts. We were snot-nosed country at that time. But what was the real goal? Canada. Because already the contest for the northern part of the North American sphere, if you will, was already taking place. Because again of events in Europe that led to the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, right? Which stretched the United States all the way across. And Lewis and Clark, as all of you know, were our first CIA agents. Their intent was not to do maps. Okay, yeah, they did some maps and so on. But what they're really testing is there a way to get to the other side on ships and not have to go all the way around, no Panama Canal, in order to get to Asia. Right? For me, when I teach why the U.S.-Mexican War then, for me, a key event is a treaty between the United States and Britain in 1846 over the Oregon Territory. Prior to that treaty, James Polk, right? You guys don't give us a treaty, we're willing to go to war with you guys. Well, Britain didn't need another war. All right? It had its hands full trying to maintain its dominance of India, sending soldiers all the way to China and this sort of thing. Not to mention the soldiery that was in South Africa. By this time they were also in Egypt. Not to mention making sure that the Irish didn't rebel again, or labor riots in various parts of England that were taking place regarding the working class and so on. So for Britain, the treaty between Oregon over Oregon with the United States was clearly an indication that they were willing to allow the United States to extend its geopolitical interest in that part of the world. Now, Britain had huge stakes here because the new nation of Mexico, after the wars of independence, was economically very weak. And they needed to get money in order to start this new nation. Where were they going to get the money from? The obvious answer was Britain. Britain had huge economic stakes in Mexico. If the situation would have been different, then the Brits probably wouldn't have cared. But already, and there's lots of books on this and so on, the various foreign ministers of England are writing letters to each other, including the embassy in Mexico, to the British colonial administrators and so on. You know, the United States is really pushing the envelope here. And the Brits had to make a decision. Do we contest this expansionary effort on the part of the United States, or do we make concessions because we have our hands full elsewhere? And so the Oregon Treaty confirmed the obvious. And that obvious was that Britain would not intervene if the United States needed to go to war in order to claim those territories for itself. And that leads eventually to the war between the United States and Mexico. So the transition from Spanish rule to Mexican rule has very little to do with Mexico itself. It has to do with what's going on outside. And the transition from Mexican rule to American rule has very little to do with Mexico per se, because many other countries in Latin America were struggling to get their governance off the ground and so on, struggling between different political constituencies, liberals and conservatives and so on. But the United States didn't pick a war with Chile. The United States didn't pick a war with Colombia. The United States didn't pick a war with Ecuador or what we now call Venezuela and so on. And in that regard, why Mexico? And of course the other side of that coin, why didn't it take it all? And if you like, with Q&A we can discuss that particular matter. In this regard then, when Alta California becomes California, as all of us know, the forces, the locus of U.S. interests changes radically. And it changes primarily because of the gold rush. The gold rush changes the energy that had been invested in taking what we now call the American Southwest and so on from Mexico. The balance of interests and so on turns inward. And one of the best examples of that is the railroad. The railroad, in a sense, consumes that energy in trying to link east and west. And in that regard, California takes on an incredible importance. The Compromise of 1850, it's all about California in many respects. And what it means for what we postponed in 1820, right? The Compromise of 1820, why we didn't take Texas in 1836. Texas wanted to become part of the United States. And we didn't take them. We allowed Texas to remain an independent republic, otherwise known as the star on the helmets of the Dallas Cowboys. All right? In this period of time then, the change in the global order provides the United States with an opportunity that it pretended it wanted, Monroe Doctrine, but was unable to complete. And it's not until the middle of the 19th century that the U.S. begins to spread its wings, if you will, where the eagle, if you will, spreads its wings much further over Latin America, in part because there's no other power that's in a position to push back, much less the Latin American republics. And a lot of that shift, not all of it, but a lot of that shift has to do with what's taking place internationally. Let me jump to bottle shock, because I only have 2 minutes left. Well, thereabouts, because I want to have time for Q&A if you have questions and this sort of thing. What's the meaning of the international wine industry for today? It has a lot of implications. First, where is the wine market in the world today? In 1976, when we had the famous tasting between the French and the United States and so on, the European countries, by far France, had already dominated the production of wine in the world. But just like France has declined as a world power, that decline was reflected in a metaphoric way in that wine tasting. Because the prestige of wine, particularly Champagne on the one hand, and the reds of Bordeaux on the other hand, have always been those two pillars of the importance of French wine in the world. Nobody else can make Champagne except the French. You can call it sparkling wine, but it's not Champagne. All right? Sort of thing. Not even other sources of production of sparkling wine in France can't call it Champagne. And of course, the reds of Bordeaux. Parentheses, if you get a chance, see this great documentary. It's called Red Obsession. And it's not about the McCarthy era. All right? It's about the obsession for the wines of France. Because for many people still, the reference point of status is not a great Cabernet from Stag's Leap. It's still the Bordeaux of France. But the important point is this, that the wine market has changed. And it reflects to some extent, and some would argue perhaps to a large extent, the changes that are taking place. Because the country that's the main protagonist in Red Obsession is China. And you will find a particular scene in there where a French producer of really high-end Bordeaux has to contend with the fact that a Chinese buyer shows up at his chateau and he says, I want to buy all of everything you have of this 1997 Bordeaux that Robert Parker says is the absolute best. I want it for myself. I don't drink wine, I don't like it much, but I want to have it so that when people come over from having the Summer Institute at the Center for Latin American Studies, I can serve it to them. All right? Sort of thing. And the French owner of the chateau, I can't do that. I can't sell all of it to you. I have customers all over the world. I can't call them, sorry, we're out. Sort of thing. And it tells us something about the power of things have changed in terms of France versus China, in terms of the United States and China. Because as some of you know, the wine consumption in China has tripled just in the last 5 years. And much of that wine is coming from Napa Sonoma. And the implications of that are several, including where is the labor coming from to pick the grapes, to prune the grapes, to plant the grapes, to take care of the vineyards, to get the grapes to the crusher, to get the crusher to the cellar master who's going to put it in the oak barrels or in the steel stainless steel tanks, and so on. Not to mention the people who actually taste the wine and begin to blend it in such a way so that the wine comes out the way that it's supposed to, if you will. Not to mention the people who bottle it, package it, and so on, and drive it to our local grocery stores or to Bevmo or Kermit Lynch, if you're at that level of buying wine over here in Berkeley, and so on. Who are those people? Overwhelmingly, it's not the same people who were doing that in 1960 or even 1970 for that matter. So the population of Sonoma and Napa has changed dramatically. In 1970, 97% of the population of Sonoma was Caucasian. 97%. Already by 2000, it has changed. Almost 20% is going to be Hispanic. And in 2010, it's almost 30%. And during the harvest season, it goes up to 40%, if you will. And that's part of this transition that is taking place in California. It's about demography, it's about economy, it's about the relationship of the United States in general, California in particular, to other powers elsewhere in the world, and the competition among those powers. In this case, over a wine market. But we all know it's not just about wine. It's other kind of markets. Whether it's our clothes, our shoes, our cars, and the like. And we're going through an important transitional period. Right? Some might argue it's the end of the American empire. We can't control things like we thought we could. We thought the situation in Iraq, it's over. Saddam Hussein is out, we're in control. Not so much. We thought by supporting certain regimes in Central America, it's over. And we got, what, 50,000 kids on the border to remind us it's not over. Things are not necessarily settled there, if you will. Not to mention other examples that we could mention. All right? So I want to end with the point that most of our local histories have international dimensions. Whether it's one city, Oakland. Where was Oakland during World War II? It was thriving. It was prosperous, and so on. But the world economy changes in relationship to the rest of the world, as well as relationship to the United States. And Oakland is a shell of what it was just 30, 40 years ago. And we could extend that to other cities, other parts of California, and so on. In that regard, Napa, Sonoma is just one little tiny piece of the iceberg above this huge water, if you will, about these changing currents that are taking place in the world today. And just like Spain had to contend with that challenge at the end of the 19th century, that's where we are at, if you will. How we contend with these challenges of trying to maintain our position, whether you like it or not, that's another story. But whether we maintain our position or we concede, the American century is over. Somebody else has to take the reins. Somebody else has to deal with all of these conflicts in a way that the world will hopefully be better, more peaceful, or conceivably go through that period of time where warfare determined what would come out at the other end of the pipeline. And I won't be around to see it. You will, and the children you teach will. And they'll have a large say in doing that. I have a class during the summer, and I ask, how many of you intend to vote? Everyone raise their hand. And it says that my welfare is going to be based on your vote. If we do away with Obamacare, get rid of Social Security, and so on, there are going to be a lot of poor professors. Right? Because we haven't put enough away to fund, for example, our love for wine. So at the wine tasting, you'll see an example of this transition where Amelia Ceja, the first woman who is the president of a wine company anywhere in California, Woman of the Year in 2009 by the California Assembly. And her family went, in manner of speaking, from rags to riches. And that's part of the transition. Not all, of course, but in her case, she is. And their wine just won Best Chardonnay in Napa in 2013. Okay. So you'll be able to taste it, all right? And you won't have to pay for anything, all right? Because that's part of our imperial power. Because we come from UC Berkeley. Thank you very much. We have time for some Q&A.
Yeah, 15 minutes.
Okay, all right. Lots of time for Q&A. Because to me, you know, trying to do this in such a short period of time, you have to leave out so much detail, nuance, subtlety, and this sort of thing. So if you have questions, please, so I can get at some of those things. The young lady in the back.
The reference to Oakland's position during World War II and after the war, do you see the wines increasing our shipping and not maybe coming to the same level as
Right.
World War II, but increasing commerce?
Most of the ships, and I think all you need to do is go a little bit into the Port of Oakland and so on. When you see the ships and the names on those ships, there are virtually no ships that are US based. They're usually foreign based. And by far, it's Chinese and Korean ships that you're seeing to a great extent, taking that business, if you will, from the United States. We could pass laws conceivably that said all ships taking wine from the United States have to be US-based carriers and the like. But if we did that, China probably wouldn't like it very much, all right? And they would probably lessen the value of their currency even more so, and we would be even in further debt to the Chinese. They're the biggest debtor country of the United States at this point, and that's very scary. So we don't want to upset the Chinese very much. As all of us know, we've made, I think, 12 or 13 efforts over the last 10 years to try to get the Chinese to raise the value of their basic currency, the yuan. And each time the Chinese listen to us very politely and say no. And we're not in a position to do much in that respect. Right? Yes?
My question goes back to the Bourbon family.
Uh-huh.
You know, what was the threat? I know, of course, you know, about the education of the Jesuits, but why did they choose the Franciscan versus the Jesuit? I mean, that's a whole big...
No, I mean, it can be explained very simply, but the reasons can be very complex. But the basic story, the short story, if you will. In the middle of the 16th century, in exchange for Spain saying, yes, the Vatican, we will make an effort to suppress Protestantism in Europe and so on, part of that deal with the Vatican on the part of the Spanish kings is that the Vatican conceded to the Spanish crown complete authority over the church in the colonies, not the Pope. So it was the crown, the king, and his minions, of course, to decide who would be the bishops, who would be the priests, who would be sent over to the New World, and so forth and so on. All right? In that respect, then, the crown was in a position to decide which orders would be given certain parts of the colonial empire to try to convert the indigenous peoples to Catholicism. And the Augustinians initially were given southern, what we now call southern Mexico, Oaxaca. And if you go to the city of Oaxaca, the major museum there tells the story. It's right next to the church started by the Dominicans. The Augustinians got the Caribbean. The Jesuits, because already they were very powerful, you can go almost anywhere, if you will, assuming that you get my permission. And the Franciscans were given originally central Mexico, okay, because they were the first ones to get there. Later, the Jesuits were Johnny-come-latelys in terms of the missionary effort in the New World. So the Franciscans were there first. And eventually, the Franciscans were pushed out to the boonies. Okay, it's like being a teacher. Would you rather teach in Berkeley, or would you rather teach in Shafter, California? Does anybody know where Shafter, California is? All right? That's why he doesn't live there. All right? Sort of thing. All right? In that sense, Alta California was the boonies. And I'm assuming Rosemary will speak about how and why. Who were these people that were willing to come to the Bakersfield, in a sense, of the Spanish Empire? With all due respect. Anybody here from Bakersfield? Okay. All right? Sort of thing. And when that conflict occurred between the crown over authority, where the Jesuits began to push back against the crown, over the question of the relationship of the Jesuits to the crown's authority and so on, given the attempt to centralize, to have more efficient, more control over the empire and so on, the Jesuits were forced out. Okay? And they had to wait until Santa Clara University to get started to make a comeback, in a manner of speaking. Okay? Sort of thing. Yes?
Related to that question, the relationship between the Vatican and these various powers.
Yes.
So Spain, so the Bourbons and the Vatican, they cut a deal.
Right.
So then the Vatican is then motivated to fight for the Mexicans against the Spanish?
The church is motivated to side with the king. And so the Catholic Church has an internal struggle during the Wars of Independence. You have a few priests who want to have a liberal republic, and you have most of the priesthood that is very conservative and very anti-independence. Right? And that's why, from the very beginning in Mexico, one of the key points of contention all during the 19th century and into the 20th century was the relationship between the government, the state, and the church. Because the church has almost always sided with the conservative forces in Mexico. And that will lead to an outright war in the case of Mexico between 1926 and 29. That is the last gasp, in a sense, of the church trying to hold on to its privileges. And that's one of the reasons why my family came over. My grandfather was a very zealous, I would have to say, fanatic Catholic. And 3 of his brothers and 1 of his sisters died in that war called the Cristero Revolt, 1926-29. He was the last male heir of the family that was left, and they shipped him to the United States. Right? And that is, again, the short story. The church I would say in Mexico, and consistently among the most reactionary in all of Latin America. And before this last pope, the two popes before him, it became even more reactionary. There was a moment where there was this liberation theology movement within the Catholic Church in Latin America and so on. It did not make any headway in Mexico. The one bishop that was really for it, Samuel Ruiz, the first chance that the Vatican had, he was out. All right? He was a voice in the wilderness within the Catholic Church in Mexico. At this. And the Catholic Church remains very conservative in Mexico despite the new pope in that regard. All right. But if you want, I can give you more detail. Is that enough of an answer for the moment? Okay. All right. Yes, ma'am.
When you're talking about the motives for sending the missions up
Yeah.
in Alta California, you talked about the Russians and stuff, the U.S. How much of a motive was to guard the trade with Manila, the Spanish trade from New Spain to Manila?
It was of secondary importance at this time because the Manila galleons, because of the currents in the Pacific, have to go high and then come down, in a sense, to get to Acapulco. Acapulco was the disembarkation point in the system and so on. So they sailed by California, but not along the coast in a manner of speaking, all right? They sailed a little further out, but that was always one of the concerns, to maintain some degree of claim over California in the event that a Manila galleon might in fact crash or something, get off course during a storm, and this sort of thing. They were more concerned by the Russians coming down and the continuing presence of the Brits, particularly because of the fur trade, John Jacob Astor and so on, the establishment of Astoria and so on. So Spain was more concerned about one or two of those powers coming in and taking all of Northern California and then conceivably going down even further. And in that respect, Britain and the United States forced Russia in 1824 to sign a treaty to give up its claims in what we would call the upper Northwest. And they were pushed back, in a sense, toward the other side of what we now call Alaska. But it took the threat of war over the issue for Russia to, quote-unquote, back down. Because it claimed at one point all the way down to the California, what we would now call the California-Oregon border in that respect. Right. Yes, ma'am.
The Spanish granted land to people in California. So why is it that the people who worked on the land, who owned the land, didn't prosper the way that?
Yeah.
You know, it's confusing to me as to
Sure,
why.
sure. No, it's not. Again, the short story. There was no internal market. So if you had 10,000 acres and you wanted to grow wheat or corn or whatever, who are you going to sell it to? There's virtually no one here, right? Maybe 10,000, maybe, if you will. The indigenous people at every opportunity tried to move away, especially after they realized that being in a mission could be bad for their health. Not to mention their religion, their culture, and so on. So it wasn't like Indians from the interior were flocking to the missions. Please, you want to be part of the missionary system and so forth. Quite the contrary, very quickly. And you know, one of those little details. See, the California Indians, unlike the Apache, Comanche, and other tribes, did not have access to the horse, where the horse could become a weapon in the contest between, in this case, Spaniards and indigenous people. They were able to domesticate the horse, in a manner of speaking, for defensive or offensive purposes until much later, when the Spaniards brought in horses and so on. Then they began to domesticate, and then they began to use the horse as a weapon. But it was too little too late, in a manner of speaking. But going back to your point, there was no internal market. Yes, the whaling ships came by. They could sell tallow and hides and all of that sort of stuff. But that's extensive agriculture, not intensive agriculture. So the Peraltas, one of the very few Spanish land grants, yes, they had gardens and so on that they could sell fruits and vegetables and so on. But those ships were not coming by with enough frequency, if you will, to actually create an internal market that would lead people to start using their agricultural capability and so on to the extent that would happen much later. The gold rush is the key in provoking agricultural development because the miners had to eat. But up until that time, and we all know the irony that within a year of the treaty between the United States and Mexico that concluded the war, gold is discovered here in California. All right, and if Mexico would have discovered it, I don't know what would have happened. But what did happen clearly led to Northern California being the focal point of the gold rush. People came to San Francisco and so on and had to go up, meaning the value of land immediately went up because of its agricultural capability. And that's why the cities in Southern California were not impacted by the gold rush in the same way that would happen here in Northern California. Santa Barbara, Los Angeles, they were dusty little tiny towns. It wouldn't be until after the Civil War that those cities began to grow and prosper and develop to the extent that by the turn of the century, San Francisco had been displaced to a large extent by what was taking place in Southern California. After World War I, it's over. LA is clearly top dog within the state, all right? And that's why we send the water down there, okay? Now, Mr. Draper may want to have some of that water stay over here when he divides up the state into 6 parts, all right? And makes LA pay for all that water and so on that's going down there and so on. And I suspect, given the population of Southern California, that is, has a snowball's chance of winning, if you will, okay? But it's part of the leverage. It's a leverage issue, right? To get more power, Northern California, we don't have the population yet to contest the political juice that's taking place in Southern California. They have more congressmen and so on. The senators are beholden to a large extent to the money from down there and so on. George Clooney and all these characters live down there and so on, right? They're not living up in Hillsburg or Santa Rosa, so to speak. And it's part of that political leverage. You have to make more concessions to Northern California in terms of resources and not have Southern California gobble them up. Both at federal and state, not to mention local levels in terms of what schools get and so on. Dense population with this new law about giving more money to the schools where high percentage of poor children and so on, Southern California is going to get a large proportion of those monies, but the increase in the population in Northern California now is nearly 20% faster than what's taking place in Southern California. So another transition that is taking place. So that's part of the contentions that are going to percolate, I suspect, over the next few years between Northern California interests and Southern California interests. Okay? So you can thank Mr. Draper for coming up with this harebrained idea that is really about the balance that is taking place. We got Silicon Valley, what do you guys have? Right? We have Hollywood, all right, or whatever. Okay, sort of thing. Any more questions?
I was just very curious about the land grants and how the idea of ownership and where that comes from. Originally, if you think about like the criollos when they got revolted in Mexico,
Right.
and they didn't like that. They had a notion of ownership that he passed on through generations. The same people with the Peralta here, they had an idea of ownership, and what does that mean? I'm very curious about that.
Ooh, let's see if I can do this in 90 seconds. After the expulsion of the Muslims, quickly followed by the expulsion of all the Jews in the Iberian Peninsula in 1492, notions of status were still based on feudal notions of status. It wasn't about how much money you had in the bank. It was about how much land you had. And that attitude, that value, if you will, was brought to the New World. And it was especially true in central Mexico for the obvious reason. All those 20, 30,000 Indians that were working in the mines of north central Mexico had to eat. And allowed them, the big haciendas as they were called, to thrive and prosper. Not only producing cattle, meat, and so on, but also wheat, barley, and so on, mainly wheat and corn. All right? In that respect, that became still, for many people, the reference point for status is owning land. And the Spanish crown knew that, because that was one of the ways it paid off people to participate in the conquest against the Muslims. Because even though a lot of people, I'm really Catholic, goddamn Muslims, or whatever it might be, well, I want you to die for me, my son, against the Muslims. Well, you know, I'm Catholic, but I don't want to die for it, you know, sort of thing. Well, you had to pay, right? So the barons, accounts, and so on, and the lower nobility, if you participate in the reconquest of Spain against the Muslims, one major way that you could get paid off was in land. And that was brought over to the New World in the idea of the encomienda. Okay, I'm sorry to throw words at you here. The important point is this became a way of currency, because Spain didn't have the money to pay people. The promise was the possibility of owning land. But there was no domestic market. The indigenous population was not densely settled and so on, in such a way that you could easily use them as a cheap source of labor and so on, because they would just take off, right? They would take off up into the hills around Berkeley and so on, and wait for the cannon to go off, where another touchdown and this sort of thing, otherwise known as killing cattle and so on, and then go back out, sort of thing. So land still had its meaning, but it didn't work in a manner of speaking, in the same way that people wanted it to work. So Bernal Díaz de Castillo, the writer of one of the major chronicles of the conquest of the Aztecs and so on, he was given land, but he ended up very poor because there was no internal market in Guatemala that he could take advantage of to sell all those commodities that conceivably could have come from his land grant. And so Peraltas had thousands and thousands of acres, but they were not rich in this respect, all right? They were rich in land, but poor in currency. So they held on in the same way that some people still held on to the idea for decades of my generation. Cadillac. That says it all. A Cadillac. And you can't afford a Cadillac, a Buick, a big one. And you can't afford that, an Oldsmobile, a big one, right? Well, after the oil shock of '73, who in the hell wanted a Cadillac, right? It cost you half your salary to go from home to church. All right, I had a Buick. My first car was a 1954 Buick, 384 cubic inches of V8 power. All right, boom, boom, right? But I didn't care. Each time I turned over the engine that way, I consumed a gallon, but it was 17 cents a gallon. Okay, sort of thing. And all our friends would chip in, right? I have a quarter, 4 gallons. Now, I mean, you have to be rich to own an expedition. Either that or you're selling drugs or something, okay? Sort of thing.
And a follow-up question would be, thank you. And a follow-up question would be then, when all these property owners, they were not, I don't know whether they were allegiance was to whether to Spain or Mexico, and suddenly you have the American invasion coming into the gold rush, and suddenly this land is being taken over.
Mm-hmm.
Where were these titles? Who owned legally? How could you come in? Where are those papers? Who traded what for what?
Right. Well,
How do
Rosemary, I suspect, will cover some of this.
Yeah.
And when you go over to the maps and this sort of thing, and on the Peralta House visit, we will actually see an example of that process, where the land titles of the Spanish-speaking settlers were challenged, and you had to go to a federal court. Unfortunately, the average, sometimes it was less, sometimes it was, the average amount of time that it took to adjudicate those claims, one against the other, was 17 years. So, but if you were the original claimant, the Peraltas, you had to pay the taxes on that land, for example, property taxes. You had to pay the lawyers, and so on. Well, one way they began to pay, because again, rich in land, poor in currency, is use land to pay the lawyer, to pay the taxes, and so on. So what happened to the land base of many Californios, as they were called? Went like this. But it went, that process took place much faster in Northern California, for the obvious reason there were more people claiming. And there's land policy, right? The Preemption Act, 1848. You get on this land, 160 acres, and it's yours. All you have to do is plant a tree to show that you, in fact, are developing the land, right? So that's where the squatting movement became especially powerful in the United States at that time. And it's related to economic crisis, particularly the Panic of 1837. Sort of thing. And again, that's an international one, because a lot of it had to do with the overinvestment in railroads in England. In England. But England had a great deal of stakes in the United States. I mean, it's all interconnected in that respect. And that's why that wonderful phrase, the local is a global and the global is the local. And a lot of things are taking place here locally that have to do with global considerations, including the price of very good wine. We can easily get a good bottle of wine now for 14, 15 bucks. It's pretty good for 40. You want to go 20? Very good. You want to go more than that? You don't have to buy a $180 bottle of wine like I did last year. All right? It was a special event. All right? It was the first date I'd had in years. Okay, so, I'm kidding. Thank you very much. Thank you.